fast-talking restaurateur who dusty hunted the Pacific coast so thoroughly in the early 2000s that he eventually used his stash to open the premier vintage spirits bar in Los Angeles. Perhaps Owen Powell and Brad Bonds might be interested in finding this stash to stock at the vintage retail stores they would open in Kentucky during the pandemic. There was also Jonah Goodman, a curly-haired Kentucky boy in his early 20s who somehow started dusty hunting before he could legally drink. His ambitions, savvy with the internet, and willingness to hop around the globe at a moment's notice had allowed him to quickly become one of the best at this crazy game. They wouldn't just need to scoop Ackerman, though. They'd all need to outwit the courts, buddy up to the lawyers, smooth talk some possibly avaricious heirs, and eventually make them an offer they couldn't refuse. Marlon Brando? You don't have to be much of a spirits connoisseur or even a drinker to have noticed that whiskey is red hot these days, with brands like Pappy Van Winkle, the Macallan, and Yamazaki becoming legitimate commodities, sold for thousands upon thousands of dollars a bottle, both legally and less than so. Unfortunately, by the mid-2010s, finding these bottles in your average American liquor store had become an impossibility unless you knew a guy, and tasting even a few ounces began to cost more than a fancy dinner for two. Thus, many spirits enthusiasts began moving on to something more accessible, which, oddly, necessitated stepping back in time. A weird quirk of spirits history, but especially bourbon history, is that for most of its existence, it existed merely to be drunk. Shocking, I know. No one collected it, and certainly no one sat on massive bunkers of it, speculating that it would be valuable one day. These days, though, I know of a personal wealth manager down in Tampa who spends $500,000 per year on rare bourbon, and he's a teetotaler. In fact, for most of the latter half of the 20th century, no one was really buying bourbon at all, seeing it as an old man's drink at best, good old boy Southern rotgut at worst. That meant many bottles lingered on store shelves, and many more bottles sat in home bars and cellars and basements and in attics, never opened, gathering dust. Thus, in the late 2000s, just as modern bourbon was having a renaissance, the concept of dusty hunting arose. That is, trekking to out-of-the-way liquor stores in small towns and sketchy neighborhoods. If the clerk sits behind bulletproof glass, that's good. In search of old bottles that never got sold for whatever reason. Or going to estate sales and flea markets, and even scouring places like eBay, Craigslist, and eventually Facebook for someone's grandpa's bottle of 1980s Wild Turkey, or 1970s Old Granddad, or maybe even 1950s Weller that had sat in a basement or attic or locked liquor cabinet for decades. Not all dusty bottles were desirable, of course. When my grandpa died, the best thing I found in his liquor cabinet was some neon green Midori from the mid-1980s, and many were hard for neophytes to date and assess. But if you taught yourself how to read barcodes and Julian dating, learned how to identify tax stamps and DSP, distilled spirits plant numbers, and knew where good juice was being distilled and when, you could end up scoring some major rarities, ones most folks weren't well schooled enough to know were tastier than just about anything being released to market these days. Dusty hunters are interesting characters, no question. Indiana Jones mixed with comic book guy from The Simpsons with a dose of John LaRoche from Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief, spending years of their lives going to seedy liquor stores, filling their houses with dusty bottles, and talking about arcana from the past all day are not necessary.